First, I'd just like to say thank you for coming out this evening. This is Project Africa's second event, and I'm excited to see all of you here, especially with Occupy Wall Street going on outside. And
inside.
And inside. So first, I would just like to say that we're honored that the GPIA program has allowed us to join in on their celebration for their 10-year anniversary. And so we welcome them. And we're definitely excited to see that GPIA program allows us to facilitate programs like these for you guys to be able to come in and hear these issues from experts that have come out to express to you the severity of the issues taking place in the Horn today. I would like to say thank you to our panelists for coming out. We have Professor Glenn Dennon from the Earth Institute. We have Ms. Sibl Lawson-Marriot from the World Food Program. We have Ms. Pietzcsh from Action Against Hunger. And then we have Mr. Duncan Mclean from Doctors Without Borders. So I'd just like to say welcome to all of them and thank you for taking the time out to come out and talk to us about this issue. At this time, we have a very full panel, so what I'm going to do is pass it on to Phil Acree, who is from the GPIA program, to talk to you a little bit about the 10-year anniversary. Thank you. One side note, can people who are sitting in the back move a little bit closer ahead so that when they come in, they can just fill in the back seats? That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, members of the panel. A distinguished group, to be sure. And I want to tell you, my name is Philip Acree. I'm Assistant Director of the Graduate Program in International Affairs. And I'm going to be a little bit formal and read from my notes so that this is correct for the video record. This event is included in the Graduate Program in International Affairs 10th Anniversary Seminar Series. Launched in 2001, GPIA at the New School celebrates growth into a robust graduate program now with nearly 400 graduate students from countries sometimes said to be 62. I would say it's more like 39 at the moment, but cumulatively we've had students from nearly 100 countries around the world, including the United States. This program has experienced sustained growth to become a unique program in international affairs. Over the course of a decade, GPIA has had more than 750 graduates and has created dialogue around critical social science perspectives on the current challenges of global media, development, human rights, urbanization, peace, and security. Our 10-year anniversary is a time for reflection on the world today and the challenges ahead. To mark our 10th anniversary, to celebrate achievements and deliberate on the future course of global affairs and the study of global affairs and action in global affairs from our perspective, we have introduced this series of events over the course of the current academic year. So we're very happy and very proud to be sponsors of this event, and we invite you to visit our website, www.gpia.info. And there you will find a complete rendering of the events for this 10th anniversary year. So once again, welcome to our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Sophia, for all your work. And thank all of you for coming here tonight. And at 8 o'clock, we'll be going over to Union Square, of course. So we'll see you there.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So let's get started. We're going to start off with Ms. Pietzcsh from Action Against Hunger.
Oh, okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. It's a new kind of terrain in the new school, so that's nice. Action Against Hunger is a non-governmental organization. We are specialized in the treatment of malnutrition and the prevention of malnutrition through water and sanitation hygiene projects, as well as food security and livelihood projects. So a very wide angle in terms of the prevention, but as well the treatment of malnutrition. So we work in chronic crises, we work in acute crises, we work as well in more longer term context depending on each of the countries. Now for tonight's event, we're working in all the 4 countries which are on the menu tonight, so Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya, since at least 10 to 15 years depending on the context. So we're very familiar with not only the current situation unfortunately, but as well the chronic situation in all of the 4 countries. We're very often working, of course, definitely with the communities, the local communities, but as well with local partners, ministries, governments, partner NGOs, with the colleagues next door, etc. Sophia asked me to define a little bit what we understand under food security, and I'm just going to quickly have a go at the 4 pillars which we consider for a household to be food secure. So one of them is food access, so physical or rather economic access, purchasing power to be able to access food. The availability of food, so either through local production or own production of the household, or availability on local markets, which is obviously very closely linked to the excess. So even if it's on the market, if you don't have the money, you won't be able to benefit from the food itself. But as well more on household level itself, the utilization of the food, the intra-household distribution between different household members, the way it's prepared, the way it is used in itself, stored, etc. And lastly, our 4th pillar is the stability of food in the household or to the household. Very often households have only a certain amount of time in the year where they're actually sufficient in their food supply, either through access or availability. So hence we consider the stability throughout the year, 12 months the year, as one of the key factors to consider a household as being food secure. Now looking at the current crisis, there's definitely been a big drought. There's 2 failed rainy seasons. The majority of the countries is bimodal, meaning there's 2 rainy seasons a year, and the last 3 have been failing. Now it started a little bit to rain, so that's good news. But definitely there is more underlying causes to the crisis itself than only the drought, which has in the different countries contributed to the development into a crisis or an emergency itself. In some areas, we clearly see a problem with security and access to the population to be able to support the needs. In other areas, we see a simple failure of state as well in terms of policies and the reaction of the government. In the past, there have always been a lot of discussions of, do we have enough information to alert the community, the humanitarian community, to react to the crisis? And it was 10 years ago still, or even 5 years ago, we didn't have enough information. Now last year, probably in September, was the first time where an alert was shared in terms of the situation on the ground in the Horn of Africa. So we cannot say we didn't have enough information, and still the reaction and the decision making was very, very slow to actually make funds available, come up with a plan, an action plan, and react to the situation, to either prevent that it would deteriorate as much as it did into, for instance, in Somalia, into a famine situation, or at least be able to react in the first steps of the situation. Do you want me to leave it there?
You can continue.
I can continue. I have no watch, so I'm not sure.
You're good.
So in terms of ACF's response to the current crisis, we're working in the most drought-affected areas in the 4 countries. We're working as well with those displaced populations coming in from Somalia into the Kenya, northeastern Kenyan regions, in the Dadaab refugee camps, with an integrated response of, again, treating malnutrition, which is already existing, looking into food security and household level water and sanitation, because there's been a big gap on the water side in all of those areas. Clearly part of the solution for us is prevention. It is much easier to look into prevention in the sense of disaster risk reduction, in terms of resource management, in terms of social safety nets or hunger safety nets which can be established, because we're dealing with a very seasonal issue here, which is reoccurring in different severities or scale, probably every year. Sometimes it's a lower level, sometimes like this year it's much, much larger scale and severity of the situation itself. There was a note on the Green Revolution, and is the Green Revolution a solution for the Horn of Africa? There has in the recent past been a lot of discussions about the Blue and the Brown Revolutions as well, in terms of the Brown Revolution looking into soil recuperation and soil focus on improving soil quality, soil utilization, etc., as it is a big, big factor in the kind of semi-arid areas in the Horn of Africa. Or as well the Blue Revolution and focusing more on micro-irrigation and actually using the water resources which are existing in a much more efficient way to improve the community and household agriculture production. So the Green Revolution itself might not be enough. We might need to have a Blue and a Brown Revolution alongside that, but in a package together with the whole disaster risk reduction activities, there's probably a big way of decreasing the chances of recurrent events like the current crisis.
What would you say Action Against Hunger is experiencing on the ground right now? Like, what level of aid do you think is needed to help your response?
I think it depends very much on the country itself. Somalia has received a lot of funds, a lot of donors have made a lot of monies available for Somalia, but often in many areas where it is the most severe in terms of situation, there is a problem with access to the population in need. So it is very difficult to reach those populations and actually deliver the aid for which we have the funding. There's a lot of resources available for the Somali population displaced in Kenya, which is great, so we can work easily in the camps. Security issues all around those areas due to the Al-Shabaab movements, etc. In Kenya, it's been a bit, for the Kenya population in Kenya, it's been a bit more difficult because a lot of donors are becoming a bit frustrated with the government, the policy level, because the Kenyan government, the Kenyan country in itself has a very strong production. They have a big food export level to different countries in the region, to the European countries, to the US as well, and specialized food production or plant production. And it is creating a significant income through those exports, and hence a lot of donors consider that as providing enough resources internally so the government should be able to respond to any needs occurring. So it's been a bit more difficult to raise funds for Kenya from the institutional donor side as such.
Okay. All right, so I'd like to move on to Mr. Mclean from Doctors Without Borders.
So likewise, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's good to have a chance to chat about so the Horn of Africa, Somalia in particular. Much like Action Against Hunger, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders is working throughout the region, particularly the camps, the refugee camps in Doloado in Ethiopia, Dadaab in Kenya, and of course Somalia proper. I would sooner focus on Somalia for the discussion, certainly because that's where I've spent focused the vast amount of my time professionally working and running back and forth to the region, and especially in the last 6 months. I look at the topic the way it was described for this the panel, the discussion tonight, and I'm a bit worried I might disappoint some of you, because certainly when talk about say longer term development, capacity building, and so on and so forth, it really I might have my own opinions on it, but it certainly falls out of the purview of what Doctors Without Borders does. I mean, for those of you unfamiliar with the organization, we're very much focused on emergency medical action, medical humanitarian action. It doesn't mean that we don't get involved in longer term treatment for HIV/AIDS, for example. Different forms of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and so on, but really the vast focus of our work throughout the world is responding to they say the cutting edge of whether it's conflicts, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's large-scale epidemics, and certainly Somalia has a little bit of all of that mixed together, which makes it a pretty relevant place for us to try and try to do something useful. And it's much like ACF as well. It's a country MSF has worked in for many years. We've been there for basically since the early 90s in one form or another, basically shifting the type of programming with the state of the conflict and natural or semi-natural disasters that befall this part of the world. Having said that, even when we talk about the famine, the F word, we've been very cautious, at least at MSF, to not get into a sort of polemic about what famine actually means. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that the information is certainly far more available than it was in the early 1990s when we speak about the region. Having said that, it's very, very difficult to have an idea of what's actually going on in central Somalia, south-central Somalia today. And coming from MSF's perspective, and we're by far not an authority on south-central Somalia, but we are present in areas controlled by the Al-Shabaab, as well as other dissident or rebel movements, as well, of course, areas controlled by the transitional federal government, which is basically limited to a sort of Manhattan block of Mogadishu. So we certainly have a vision of what's happening throughout the country, but a very limited vision, and I would say often restricted to the periphery of the hospitals, the health structures that we support. So I won't really be able to speak about longer-term development in Somalia. It's almost it's not to be too pejorative, but it's almost an irrelevant question in the current predicament in which Somalis find themselves. What I thought would be interesting, perhaps, is to speak a bit about what is the situation on the ground, on the other hand, and also certainly problems that MSF is facing, and I don't think we're alone in confronting those issues to actually bring support to those people in need in the country, and also some of the major concerns we have when we look at recent developments, particularly the recent military initiatives, not only by the African Union, speaking about AMISOM in particular, but also by the Kenyans in the last few weeks, which are extremely significant in our opinion, and also a bit of a repetition of what we've seen in the past in Somalia, and certainly what has not worked in the past, and I think that's worth highlighting as well. Certainly, when we look at the difficulties of working in Somalia today, to be too categorical, but I think we can divide it into different areas of access and problems, and I would start with the area that MSF has worked in for the last 5 years, specifically, and what is now areas controlled by the Al-Shabaab, Al-Mujahideen, the Islamic militias. And these projects, as I say, well predate the current nutrition crisis, the current drought, but have been a constant challenge to keep up and running. And these projects were initially started by a mix of MSF Somali staff and international staff, and gradually over the years we've pulled back the international staff because of numerous security incidents. MSF, as with many other organizations, have lost many local and international staff through either we're specifically targeted or in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this not just in terms of deaths but also in terms of kidnapping. I mean, and again, there's a very recent example where we had two colleagues that were kidnapped in Dadaab and are still somewhere in Somalia today. But we've nonetheless maintained these programs through national staff, basically because there is no health infrastructure in Somalia today. I mean, it's almost a cliche when you see it repeated so many times in the media, but I mean, without a functioning government in the last 20 years and no public health system to speak of, either private hospitals, private clinics, or what is provided by humanitarian organizations is basically the limits of access to healthcare. Including or especially in those areas controlled by the Al-Shabaab. So those are projects that are essentially designed around basic bush hospitals. Again, not to be pejorative, but they're not especially complicated programs, basic inpatient, outpatient departments, and long-standing nutrition programs treating severe acute malnutrition, vaccination activities within the hospitals themselves that are more or less tolerated. But as I said, a constant period of negotiation to keep it's also a bit of jargon, perhaps even internal MSF jargon, but to keep a humanitarian space of sorts to be able to operate in conditions that we consider acceptable, meaning basically to be independent and to be recognized as a neutral location. Probably one exception to that would be a hospital we run in Danile district. Danile is one of the 16 districts that comprise Mogadishu, and it's one of the last districts controlled by the Al-Shabaab today. And this is not simply a basic hospital, but it's a surgical program that we've been treating war wounded throughout the conflict, and certainly had an intense amount of activity in recent weeks as Al-Shabaab has been basically pushed further and further into the outskirts of Mogadishu and over to the west in an area called the Afgoy Corridor, this sort of peri-urban area that's been housing displaced from the conflict specifically, much less from the drought over recent years. And that's certainly, if we look at how that conflict in Somalia has developed in recent years, and you can see up until the beginning of August this year, you had the front line running right through the middle of the city. Al-Shabaab did what they called a tactical retreat over the course of a few hours in the beginning of August, moved to the outskirts, and basically this hospital in particular has been receiving war wounded from that fighting and continues to this day. And so, speaking about really the broader areas of South Central Somalia, it's the major problematic that we face is access and this very, very laborious, tenuous, constant state of negotiation with different levels of the Al-Shabaab movement to be able to conduct our medical activities. On the other side, we could also talk about Mogadishu itself, and their MSF, but many other organizations as well, have opened up a number of emergency programs in recent months, and this is very much linked to the influx of displaced. I mean, it's very well documented the number of people that have fled the country. Again, we mentioned earlier Ethiopia and Kenya. There's a large number of displaced in the country in camps controlled by the Al-Shabaab movement. I mean, they do food distribution to varying degrees. They do have some health activities. We've worked in some of these camps. And then there's the capital itself, where estimates are, maybe a colleague from WFP can correct me afterwards, but I've heard estimates of everywhere from 200,000 to 350,000 displaced in Mogadishu itself. Very, very difficult to estimate. It's also why I'm very cautious about throwing around numbers, because you're talking about 700, something I've heard repeated endlessly in the media as well, 750,000 people in Somalia at risk of starvation. It's extremely difficult even to count the number of people in Mogadishu today, let alone those parts of the country where we have no access or very, very limited access altogether. But certainly it's very clear is basically in Mogadishu, as the Shabaab has moved out and space has opened up, there's been a continuing influx of IDPs, of internally displaced persons, setting up these makeshift camps throughout the city. So we've launched a number of activities in the capital, whether they're, let's say, looking at the sharp end of malnutrition, severe acute malnutrition, therapeutic feeding programs, and hospitalization for those severely ill children with medical complications, and then also basic inpatient activities for those suffering from whether it's from cholera, which has been found periodically in the capital and elsewhere, or other forms of severe acute watery diarrhea. Beyond that, and what we consider probably the highest cause of mortality in the capital today, measles, which is absolutely rampant, which is not very difficult to understand why when you look at the conditions within the camps themselves. Extremely densely populated, very, very unsanitary, and you look at vaccination coverage in Somalia, given the lack of any public health infrastructure, very, very low. So diseases such as that, they spread very, very quickly, and very, very difficult to control. And to actually stop a measles outbreak, you need to have about 90% coverage. And under the conditions even in Mogadishu, where we have access for international staff, again, where myself I've been going frequently in recent months, it's extremely difficult to even imagine having that type of coverage, which raises to me a second point, or a second problematic of working in Somalia today in those specific areas of Mogadishu. There's been a lot of rhetoric about, with the Shabaab having moved out, that sort of conditions have somehow improved, that the security situation has improved, and I think this is absolutely false. I think Mogadishu is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than what it was in the previous year. Again, instead of having a front line running through the middle of the city, where you could more or less organize your movements around that using all sorts of prudence and caution, would say the nature of the violence is much more random, which does make it extremely difficult to carry out not just medical activities, but any type of aid activity. You just look at it, basically now it's certainly intensified in the recent weeks, but you would find easily half a dozen grenade attacks or improvised explosive attacks on government installations, AMISOM troop movements, transitional federal government troops, literally on a daily basis. And some of them quite dramatic as well. I mean, we look at the one at K4, an area right in the middle of Mogadishu a few weeks ago that killed some 70 to 100 people, several hundred injured. This is a regular occurrence. I mean, as usual, you need to have a high enough body count for it to get a bit of media attention, but it's certainly a daily occurrence in the capital today. And beyond that, even basic, almost mundane aid activities such as food distribution, and I'm not sure whether you'll speak about that later, but certainly we see major security incidents almost every time there's a food distribution of some kind or another, either because it's extremely chaotic, difficulties in registration, people unsatisfied because they haven't received their rations or whatever, and you have frequent instances of camp security firing on, shooting at internally displaced persons, and a number of deaths. I mean, again, this is a weekly occurrence and a reality of working in Mogadishu today. And then beyond that, simply to have a very basic activity, you have to negotiate for days, if not weeks. And that's a real particularity of working in Somalia. It's probably worth highlighting as well. Is the basic fact that some of the greatest dangers are less being in the wrong place, wrong time, involved in with regards to the political conflict, and much more with relation to the use of resources, whether human or material. You rent a car, normal. Every aid agency does that. You rent it from one clan, one group. You're going to annoy a number of others. Everyone wants a piece of the pie, and so you have to juggle that to be able to work safely. Because you annoy the wrong person, conflicts in that part of the world have a tendency to be settled in fairly violent ways. And the same thing goes to hiring staff. Someone feels that they've been treated unjustly, have not received the employment that they've been promised or thought they would have been promised. You're likely to have security issues afterwards because, again, disputes can be settled in, or quite often settled in quite violent means. And certainly the staff that we've lost historically have been much more related to resource issues rather than again, this political nature of the conflict. And just to finish, I'd say a last few words about the recent developments, which is also of a third point I would like to raise, and a major concern to MSF, and certainly not just us as far as the humanitarian situation in the country is concerned today. Is certainly the increase in military activity. I notice in the outline we speak of you speak of interclan or intertribal warfare. I mean, it's really important to keep in mind that Somalia is a bit of a playground for great power and regional intervention. And it's not to say that Somalis themselves are blameless for the current situation. Obviously not. But having said that, go back to the Cold War. We can do a nice historical review of everything from the Americans' Operation Restore Hope to the Ethiopian intervention 2006, 2008, to what the Kenyans and the African Union are attempting to do today. And certainly our experience and our view is that any attempt to impose a military solution to a humanitarian crisis, and it is a crisis, will not be successful. And that's not sort of a blind, ethical, naive statement. It's based very much on the experience that we've had there, and I'm sure others have had as well. And we look specifically at what the Kenyans are attempting to do now. Certainly their security prerogatives, based on what they perceive as threats to their border because of the Al-Shabaab movement and banditry, piracy, and so on. Certainly as MSF at least, we have absolutely nothing to say about that. We have no legitimacy to speak about the security concerns of the Kenyans. It's not our business. However, as soon as that military action is justified on humanitarian grounds, whether it's to open up buffer zones, humanitarian corridors, or what they were saying initially to secure the release of our two colleagues, that we have a major problem with. Because as I said at the start, it's only through negotiation that we consider it possible to work in that environment, or generally, actually, to generalize far beyond Somalia. So what we certainly tried to do is distance ourselves from those military initiatives by the Kenyans, but also, for that matter, by AMISOM. And we see the direct impact on the population today. We got into a pretty major dispute with the Kenyan authorities a few weeks ago when they bombed an IDP camp, an internally displaced camp in Jilib. so just near Kismayo in the south. Initially, it was claimed that they bombed an Al-Shabaab training camp and killed a number of leaders and injured. I think it killed 10 and injured 40. Meanwhile, in the clinics that we were running, we found a similar number of women and children arriving, either dead or with shrapnel injuries that correspond to aerial bombardments. So obviously, a fairly different perspective on that event. Again, not to criticize the military initiative itself, but done on those grounds, we see the impact directly in front of our own eyes. Same thing in Danili, the hospital that I mentioned previously on the outskirts of Mogadishu. We had to interrupt a vaccination campaign targeting 35,000 kids because of the fighting around the hospital. And the hospital itself has been shelled a number of times, which is obviously something we've raised at different levels and not always been especially appreciated for it. But well, those things need to be raised. And so looking at the way that the same mistakes that have been made historically in Somalia in terms of militarizing humanitarian relief, we see them being made again today, and think it's quite important that we speak out about this because, again, in our opinion, it's not only not going to improve the situation, it's not going to facilitate aid, and in fact, it's going to make targets of the aid workers themselves, which is obviously very worrying development when you're trying to do something useful. Voila, that's all. I'll end with that happy note.
Thank you, Mr. Mclean. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Ms. Sibl Lawson-Marriot. She's from the World Food Program.
And I've just taken out my paragraph where I was going to describe the operating environment in Somalia, because I think we've gotten a, no, that's great. We've gotten a good picture. No, that's very sobering. So WFP, the World Food Program, is the food assistance arm of the UN. It's the largest humanitarian agency just in terms of numbers and operations and so on. And we work mostly with partners. In fact, these are some of our favorite partners right here, Action Against Hunger and MSF. The work that they're doing right now in Somalia is really incredible. So we really salute you for that. And these are areas that WFP cannot go, and only very few agencies have been able to really tread that fine line that he's been describing. So Somalia is our greatest operational challenge. You know, we work in areas of chronic hunger and emergency response, and we feel like our mandate is anything that relates to food security. So, I mean, it's clear that there is something troubling happening in the Horn of Africa. We know that there's a famine in Somalia, but there's also, most of us are aware, an issue in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and even in northern Uganda. And to put some figures on it, and these will be the only figures that I hope to cite today, the number of people who are in crisis in the Horn is 13 million, which is a staggering, staggering number. I'm half from Benin, and it has 5 million people. So that's the kind of measuring bar that I use. WFP is only targeting 11 million of those, and the balance will be handled by governments and other partners. Most of our work is being done through partners just like these. Compare that with well, let's go by country. So in Kenya, it's a 3.5 million caseload, and in Ethiopia, it's a 3.7 million caseload, and Somalia is 1.9, so much smaller than the other countries. And the crisis is playing out very differently from country to country, and the ways in which it's playing out, I think, speaks volumes. For us, famine is the F word in this business. I mean, really, it's not used lightly. Like when you say there's a famine, it's a very technical term, and it's to do with mortality and morbidity and other things that I'm not entirely familiar with all the different things. But there are people who, there's actually quite a debate about whether should it really be a famine, but the point is that Somalia is the only area where we're talking about this. We don't see much of the famine with a capital F anymore, and there's a reason for that, because by the time a crisis gets to famine status, many, many things have gone very, very wrong. In July of this year, as Silke mentioned, famine was declared in 2 regions of southern Somalia. And here we are in November. Since then, 4 more have followed, including Mogadishu, the capital. We're told, as he mentioned, that we haven't seen the worst of it yet, even as, you know, the international community and others are so engaged with the crisis that we're sitting here talking about it in academic forum today. And many people will say when the crisis is being discussed, oh, but you know, droughts happen all the time, and this is recurrent. Why? This is very true, particularly in this region. So why did this drought result in a famine? Vast topic, and our time is limited, so there are many directions that we could go with it. And the first is to go political and talk about the lack of functional government, the armed groups that deny access and restrict movements of populations. But luckily, I'm a humanitarian, and humanitarians are generally not encouraged to pronounce on politics, so I'm saved on that count. We have people who are experts on agricultural policy and livelihoods and working on inaccessible areas, so I thought I'd leave that to them. And with our limited time, I just wanted to make 3 points about the humanitarian response, and hope that we can use the time for questions. I think the first thing to keep in mind about this humanitarian response is that this is not your mother's humanitarian response. You know, this is the way things have changed. The way business is being done has changed, and dramatically. If I just look at WFP, my own agency, the way it's almost unrecognizable from the WFP of maybe a decade ago. A different approach. It starts with the approach, different tools. I brought this. I thought this is a life-saving revolution. Really, it is. This is a simple paste. It's made. This one's actually made in Pakistan, but they are making it in Ethiopia and Malawi and many other places. It's a simple paste. It's made from chickpeas. It's locally produced. It has vitamins and minerals and animal protein. Very simple product. Think of it as like super peanut butter. RED calls it humanitarian hummus, but you get the point. It's ready to use. It doesn't need refrigeration. You don't have to mix it with water. You can take it to a woman and leave it with her there. She can take it away if she comes to see you. It's cheap. It supports the local economy, and it works miracles. So this is just one small example of things that are being done differently, and you don't even want to know what we were using before, but this is an improvement. It's like using a wider base of knowledge and using technologies, particularly with institutes like the Earth Institute, who are very much about bringing research to bear on the work that's being done today. The idea being that long gone are the days when humanitarian agencies would bring agricultural surpluses and dump them on distant shores and not think about local preferences or the potential impact on the market or concerned about dependency. It's not perfect, but that is not the approach anymore. It's understood that those are all things that need to be taken into account. Another example is many WFP beneficiaries and other agency beneficiaries now get cash or vouchers. This was not the case before. You can exchange the vouchers for a local food, a staple food, or for your preference. Sometimes it's complemented. There's actual food. I mean, this can only work when the conditions are right. Food has to be available, but WFP and partners will study the market and the capacity of the vendors, and if the condition is right, we'll make the deals. And we like the fact that the local economies are getting a kickstart on the way. The second thing I think worth noting about this humanitarian response is you have, and this is not that widely known, but you have a remarkable proliferation of new donors, non-traditional donors, and they're very concerned that these are not new to the work of helping others, but they're new to this international coordinated forum. They've been less visible in previous crises, so I'm talking about Turkey, notably, Qatar, many other countries from Gulf countries, Islamic NGOs. They've been very active in Somalia, all over the country, including in areas where other people do not have access. They're extremely committed, and their constituencies have been extremely generous in terms of resources, the money. This has broadened the base of support, and this definitively changes the dynamics of the discussion. It changes the direction of the discussion. It widens it. It widens the space that people have to respond, and it has made more resources available. It's not perfect yet. There's a lot of work to be done around coordination. What are you doing? What are we doing? Where are the gaps? Where can we fill them? But it's been, just the broadening of actors itself is a paradigm shift. The last one, I think I will get some debate from my panelists, but this is the first time around that at least we are seeing serious, committed, substantive discussions that put local communities at the center of the discourse and are talking about long-term planning to mitigate the effect of these weather events in future. This too can be considered an evolution. Personally, in my career, I've not seen so much attention and resources. By attention, I mean resources. I mean people are putting money into these things, recognizing the fact that this erratic and unpredictable weather is not going to go away, and we cannot afford, literally, we cannot afford to have another crisis. And so now resilience building and preparedness and adaptation are the buzzwords. The countries that took steps to implement some of these things, we were talking amongst ourselves before it started, the countries that took steps to implement mitigation strategies or adaptation, they are having a much easier time of it now. And that is sending a powerful message to the other countries like, let's maybe think about this, let's put some money to this, let's draw on the resources that are available. There is an unprecedented attention to South-South cooperation, which is one of my personal favorite things, triangular partnerships between, say, a donor country, a recipient country, but maybe another country that might be an emerging donor or a non-traditional donor, but a country that has recently experienced some of the similar conditions that these other countries are trying to face. That's very, very compelling. The BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Mexico, even other countries exchange within Africa, there's a lot of potential there, and that also is a paradigm shift and a difference in the dynamic of the discussions. Last week, as an example, the government of Brazil and WFP opened a center of excellence in Bahia, Brazil, dedicated purely to food security, attended by lots of African ministers and so on. The idea being to learn from Brazil's hard-won fight and successful battle with chronic hunger, huge country, large poor population, amazing strides, and other countries in Latin America that have successfully adapted. This is fascinating, and I have already applied to work there, not for the caipirinhas and the beautiful beaches, but because I think it's very interesting to learn more about triangular partnerships. Seriously, just to conclude, I think that there is a coherence to the policy discussions and interventions and a seriousness about working with governments and communities that was not there before. There's a recognition of the fact, you've heard it mentioned on 2 separate occasions already, that it makes no sense for the world to come running when the worst has already happened and people are dying in the tens of thousands and it's a CNN moment. These should not be the triggers for our action. It's a good thing that we live in a world where we collectively agree that there's this minimum level of deprivation that we just cannot accept collectively. That we have a responsibility to address a situation where a helpless child might be starving and the parents may have exhausted their coping mechanisms and its irreversible danger will be done perhaps to the child nutritionally and that this is compounding itself and then the world steps in. So when you say the humanitarian community, they're doing this on behalf of the world. You know, all these governments are paying the money for this to be done in that way. Is there more that we could do to avoid this kind of peril in the future? Yes. Can we do better? Yes. Can we perhaps, for example, listen more to, say, pastoralists who know more about surviving in water-scarce, arid dry lands than the international community does? Are we going to take a longer but surer route to food security where we do some of the things like supporting smallholder agriculture, supporting local markets, creating structured demand, things like that, agro-processing that's going to have value addition, livelihood support? Or are we going to take shortcuts, rush about, and say that we're saving lives, not put in place the systems where early warnings will actually trigger actions, as you were saying, and that local communities, the vision is that local communities, individual people, families have the tools to adapt on their own without international assistance. He has said that the worst of the suffering and the loss is yet to come, that without the rains there'll be measles and cholera and other infectious diseases that will ravage the very young and the very weak. This next phase is going to test the resolve of partners, old and new, and demand more of us than I think has been demanded thus far. In spite of this, and in spite of Duncan's presentation, I would still respectfully submit for your consideration that there is a new day, there are new tools, new actors, new approach in the field. Lives are being saved every day. And the people of the Horn, especially the Somalis, as you can imagine, are amongst the most resilient and resourceful people on the earth. We should be putting them at the center of the discourse and keeping them there, asking what more we can do to support their efforts. That was supposed to be the end, but I just wanted to say a word on the military incursion because he's right, it's very important development. And I just wanted to let you know that certainly at the UN, this is discussed on an almost daily basis. And the humanitarian community has been very active, NGOs in the UN working together to make sure that the Kenyan government is held accountable for its actions, that they're aware that they've actually bombed MSF staff and clinics. I mean, that's actually talked about. The Security Council is talking about it. The humanitarian community has put together a paper that details very clearly what the implications are going to be of military action if it lasts for a month, if it lasts. There are a lot of things, a lot of activity being done. Whether they will listen is another story, but certainly they're being reminded of these. And I agree with all the other assessments of the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to Mr. Dunning from the Earth Institute. And I just want to say a special note. I really wanted him to talk today because I think when we hear about famine, we always hear about the dire situation on the ground, long-term solutions and what's in place to actually end this from reoccurring again. And so I really wanted him to come and speak to us about what he's working on and what other organizations are working on to stop famine from reoccurring. So,
okay, thanks.
Welcome.
I speak through this, yeah. Thanks, Sophia, and thanks to GPIA and to the Project Africa for this opportunity. I actually don't think I'm going to disagree as much as you were hoping or suggesting, but I'm sure we're going to have a good interaction with the audience. Just want to make a couple of points just to start off with. First of all, I'm going to be using slides. Normally it's the other way around. Everybody uses slides and somebody stands out by not using them, so I don't feel quite so bad this time. But I am a professor, and you know, up the road there at 118th in Amsterdam, and I tend to use these PowerPoints a lot, and I'm sorry that I have to subject you to them now. I'm not as good as these sit-down speeches as some of my friends here. But before going to Columbia 2 years ago to set up a new master's in it's a master's in public administration in development practice, I was a practitioner myself. I spent 11 years in Africa. I spent 11 years in Nairobi, actually, working across the continent. But to be quite honest, I really don't do war zones. I have not worked in the kinds of places you know, these courageous people have. And I honestly don't have, what I'm going to be talking about today is not how to solve that crisis now. It'll be a little bit more about how we can lay the groundwork for future crises not to happen. And in the event that they do happen, that we can actually resolve that relatively quickly, at least in terms of getting food where it's needed, and which is one of the major things that these organizations, particularly WFP, do. And, you know, her director goes around the world with a red cup. I don't know if you've ever seen Josette Chiran in action, but she carries this red cup. I think it came from a girl in Rwanda, right? And she always talks about the importance of being able to fill that cup and basically the challenge WFP has in filling that cup. And that cup is made a lot harder to fill because of high food prices and the downturn in the global economy, which has sent lots of donors to saying, you know, we really can't afford this kind of thing. You keep coming back to us, asking us for more. Well, they're actually asking for twice as much money now to fill the same cup, and that's the big challenge. And I think that's a little bit more of what I'll be sort of addressing at the moment, sort of the bigger issues, putting the Horn of Africa into a larger regional and global context of food security. And if we look at the situation here, I mean, clearly it stands out in terms of the level of stress and the crisis across the continent. That's not the complete picture, of course, but relatively speaking, it's a very intense crisis that we're looking at. But much of the rest of Africa, we talked about, was it 11 million, you said, people, but, you know, in immediate a crisis situation. But if we look at the numbers, much of the rest of the continent is in what they call a silent form of hunger, which is not exactly dying and getting on CNN, but basically being undernourished and having your lives compromised. And these are the numbers that FAO have produced. And, you know, after a modest improvements over a number of years. The one on the right here, this is the proportion of undernourished people in developing countries, and it was declining as a proportion. We would say we were doing pretty well up to, you know, about the late 90s, 2000 and so on. Then it kind of flattened off. It made quite a big jump when the global food crisis came in. And essentially we've been at about that same level ever since. We're talking about 1 billion people. 1 out of 7 people on the planet are currently undernourished. Now, about a quarter of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. A surprisingly large amount are still in Asia, despite the economic growth that's occurred. A lot of that's to do with India and the South Asia enigma that it's called. But in sub-Saharan Africa, basically 30% of the population, a third of the population, is having inadequate food. And if we look across the whole continent there, this is the global hunger index that IFPRI comes out with. You'll see that we do have, Somalia doesn't even quite get on the map because the data wasn't available for the various components of the indicator, but let's just assume that's bright red. But much of the rest of the continent, again, if you look globally, it's most of Africa, it's South Asia, and to a lesser extent Southeast Asia. Now this table is about 12, 18 months old now, but basically it identified the countries that at that time were at risk of humanitarian impacts of the rising food prices. Now that list on the left, you'll see that I think it's 19 out of the 22 countries are from Africa. Then that's the extreme risk, the red lot. The orange ones, you put the two together, the extreme and the high, and it becomes 29 out of 36 countries were at the greatest level of risk. So a lot of the humanitarian risk around food is definitely focused on Africa. Now, one part of that, and not the only part, which I'll come to in a moment, is the difference, the vast difference in agricultural productivity between Africa and Asia. That difference is, there was the comment about the green revolution, whether it should be brown or blue or some other color. Kofi Annan called it rainbow at some stage, and I thought that was pretty insightful. But clearly there's been huge improvements in Asia vis-a-vis Africa, and this actually shows that trend on a per capita basis. So you don't have to look at disentangle all those lines, but the general dotted line is the world, and that basically tells you that productivity per person on a global basis has been going on consistently for the last 50 years, essentially escaping Malthus, if you like, in terms of keeping ahead of population. Look at China. China's done remarkably well to keep ahead of the game there. Look at Africa, the orange line. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region where per capita food production has actually declined over the past 40 years. So a question a lot of people ask then is, why did that green revolution that had so much impact in Asia and to a large extent set the foundation for the kind of economic growth that's taken place in most parts of Asia, including China, why didn't that reach Africa? And there are a number of reasons we have here. There's no one reason. It's different in different parts of the continent. You know, Africa, after all, is 54 countries with a huge number of agroecological zones. But in fact, that is one of the main reasons it never reached Africa. The diversity of African agriculture meant that you didn't have that silver bullet. You couldn't do what you did in Asia, which was better rice and wheat varieties. Bang, that covered about 70 or 80% of the agricultural land and people's eating habits. Another big difference was Africa was 96% rain-fed, whereas Asia was about half of the continent was irrigated. And when you're in a rain-fed situation, when the droughts come, when climate change comes, you're much more vulnerable. There was a much heavier health burden in Africa, and especially malaria. A much more, we'll hear from the health colleague there whether he agrees, but generally the malariologists believe it's a much harder malaria to knock in Africa. Poor infrastructure, low population densities that made it difficult to justify large investments in infrastructure. And of course, the usual ones rolled out. We hear political instability. Of course, there was an urban bias. Structural adjustment essentially killed public sector support for agriculture at a time when it really needed it. And various governments, as well as the World Bank, basically said, you know, we're not going to invest in agriculture just at the time they needed to. So as a result, you end up with a situation across the whole continent, the Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, the Sahel, everywhere. Low external input and low productivity. And I call it unsustainable low external input agriculture. These reasons for farmers not using fertilizers are pretty obvious. They're expensive. Small-scale poor farmers don't have cash. Credit institutions are not well developed. Private suppliers, which basically the reason why structural adjustment was brought in, or the rationale was the private sector would come in and provide the goods and services that the small-scale entrepreneurs needed. It didn't happen. And to this day, we don't see private suppliers in remote rural areas. So farmers had no access to improved seeds, no access to extension services. Donors, for philosophical reasons, were against subsidies, despite huge subsidies to their own economies, and particularly their agricultural sectors. Fertilizer use was 10 kilograms of nutrient per hectare. Maize yields were 1 ton. And if you want a comparison, the maize yield in Iowa in this country is 10 tons per hectare, and it's completely rain-fed. It's not even irrigated. So 1 versus 10 is the kind of contrast. I won't go into this, but just to say very simply, a farmer in Western Kenya is basically extracting nutrients. He's taking away more food than he's putting back into the soil. A farmer in the United States, after many years of extension and now precision agriculture and the like, has more or less got it right. Now, in the meantime, the whole Gulf of, Gulf of Mexico, all that area has just been ruined because of eutrophication, but at least now it's about right. North China, East Asia has gone berserk. Nutrients polluting groundwater, the soils, and the waters. So there's a big contrast there between Africa, China, and North America. And you look at these, this basically tells you how much nutrient is mined out of the soil. I often think, we talk about extractive industries, one of the biggest extractive industries in Africa is agriculture. It takes out nutrients, it pulls the nutrients out, takes it to the cities, and well, it ends up in the rivers and in the sea and wherever else, but it doesn't end up back on the farm. So over 60 kilograms of, per hectare per year, 21 countries are extracting that much. In net terms. Look at Somalia, it's the highest level. Another 22 countries are extracting 30 to 60. So basically you've got this big, kind of visualize it as a kind of a major mining operation going on across Africa to feed 1 billion people, almost 1 billion people. Now, there is, of course, a somewhat idealist view that, yes, but this can be somehow, we can do this organically. Now, this is where I do tend to run into some conflicts here and there with folks who want that to be true. And I'd like it to be true too, but it won't happen. It won't happen because you simply cannot restore the soils that have been degraded to the point that they have been through the amount of organic matter that you can find around. There you have legumes, and getting legumes into the system is absolutely a start, but legumes only add 1 nutrient, principally 1, and that's nitrogen. It doesn't bring you back your other major macro and micronutrients. There simply aren't enough animal numbers in many of the areas for farmyard manure to work. So one way or the other, you're going to need this stuff, and that is chemical fertilizer. And as I said, 10 kilograms per hectare per year is what is currently used. But obviously, ideally an integrated form of inorganic and organic will be needed. So all this, is this reason for hope or reason for despair in Africa? Sounds despairing by what you're hearing, right? And see, we haven't really mentioned here, but the price of food has gone crazy. It shot up in 2008, and we thought, well, it'll never go back up that high again. Well, actually, February this year, it actually passed that level again. So we've dropped back a little bit since then, but we're still higher. The whole food index, and particularly the cereals, is above the level it was 12 months ago. So again, is that an opportunity? No, because almost every African country is a net importer of food. It's not exporting. So who's making money in these markets? It's the countries that are able to export. It's Thailand, Vietnam, basically Brazil, Argentina. All the big food exporting countries are making an absolute killing with these high prices. And as a consequence, the countries that import and the World Food Programme that has to buy to get it to these camps is suffering as a result. And it sounds like I'm auditioning for a job with WFP. It's a great organization, and I highly recommend them. But, you know, to quote Josette Chiron, this is one of my favorite quotes from her: there's nothing more basic than food. If people don't have it, one of three things happens: they revolt, they migrate, or they die. And we've seen all of those things actually happening in the last 12 months or so. It's been very clear. Cities have been destroyed. People have gone on migrations basically across the Horn of Africa to escape hunger. So there's two pathways out of all that. There's two pathways of hope I'd like to talk about: extensification and intensification. And one of the things that you will, I guess, if you've been following this closely, you've been hearing about the famous land grab. I mean, as the prices have gone up, everybody's been saying, well, where's the land? We need to produce more food. Doesn't matter if you're in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan. Many of these countries that simply don't have enough food have been looking towards Africa, because that's the place where there's still a lot of empty land. And so we've seen, you know, unprecedented movement, not just from, you know, sovereign funds like the ones I mentioned, but also from just plain old private investors who've said there's a buck to be made in agriculture. All these other things don't seem to work as well: stock markets, property, and the rest. So it's become a commodity. So not just the food itself, but the ability to produce that food, including fertilizer. That was just an example. But so where is the land? Well, to be honest, it really is in Africa. These are numbers that the World Bank put together. There's 445 roughly million hectares, 445 million hectares, million hectares of agricultural land that can be brought back into production. Now this is not, this doesn't include like taking out the Amazon and the Congo and this is land that was already farmed, is degraded, is used very lightly or not at all now, but can be brought back into production. Now, 200 million hectares of that is actually in Africa. The other big area is Latin America. But look at it, it's, you know, almost half of what's available is actually in Africa, and some of that is in fact in the Horn of Africa, in southern Sudan, in Ethiopia, and is currently being exploited for this purpose. The other part of the picture is the intensification. So one way you can increase production so that Africa is not a net importer of large quantities of food is to expand the area. The other way is to say, well, what we farm already, like I told you, 1 ton per hectare of maize, let's intensify it. And most countries are operating at about 20% of their practical production potential. This is practical. This is not like compared to research numbers. This is what can be by the best farmers produced. So a huge amount. You could easily think of Africa doubling, tripling, even quadrupling its agricultural production over time through a combination of careful extensification and science-based intensification. So as our colleague here mentioned, food and nutritional security has these three components. In fact, there's a fourth one, that's stability. I agree with stability. I think it cuts across all of these: stability of availability, access, and stability in terms of utilization. But these are the three critical components. So although I am an agriculturalist, and that's what I've been talking about up until now, I totally agree with the idea that availability per se, producing the food on its own, is still not enough. You have to ensure that people have access, the buying power to, or the working power to access that food. We've applied this model combining the three areas across Africa, but we've also looked at the utilization side of it, where we improve water supply and health services so that people, it's not good enough to have enough food, but you've also got to be able to use that food properly. So the Millennium Villages project, where we've been working across the region, including that location called Dirtu, which is in Garissa district or province of Kenya, in the heart of the Horn of Africa. And so far we've found pretty remarkable resilience by investing across all of the sectors in these areas. It's something in the order of $120 per person per year. But compare that to the humanitarian relief costs, it's actually a pretty good deal. So we're in a process right now of scaling up 6 years of experience in this cluster of villages in Dirtu in northeastern Kenya through a drylands initiative across several countries in the East African region. So what are some of the lessons we have which we could share, I think? And again, this provides a kind of a platform for preparing for the future, for making sure that these kinds of disasters don't happen again. Now, the caveat, of course, is that there's nothing I can do about the civil disruption, the kinds of problems that we've seen in some countries, even where you have enough food. But certainly where there is enough food and there is enough income, the prospects of the kind of disaster we're witnessing in the Horn of Africa are not as great. So addressing soil fertility, as I described earlier, it's just so fundamental. In the case of Africa, we have to address replenishing the soils using some combination of inorganic and organic. Combining that with good varieties, well-adapted varieties. I said, yes, we had a green revolution in Asia, but it was a lot of hard work, but it was relatively easy in that we were able to focus on only a couple of crops. Many of the crops that are grown in Africa, and many of the farmers in Africa, in fact, crop livestock producers, agro-pastoralists. The attention on animals hasn't been as much as attention on crops. Irrigation should expand, but we don't use the rainwater that we have. Using rain-fed agriculture is still where we have the greatest potential for improving productivity. Cutting the post-harvest losses, 30 to 40% of everything that's produced is basically lost through insects, through rats, and transport losses and the like. A whole suite of activities around adaptation to climate change, better recognition of women, because in most cases they're the principal farming person, the person who does the labor, and generally the person who does the decision making, at least until such time as the crop and the farm becomes profitable, and then usually the men come in and start making a few decisions, mainly on how the money is spent, not on what decisions to make in the agriculture. So supporting agribusiness development and the like, I won't go through all of those. So in Malawi, this has been taken to scale across the whole country with a very strong emphasis on maize production. However, some good results here. Improved national food security, household food insecurity down from 5 million to 500,000. Wage rates went up as a result. A lot more local economy. More kids went to school. Export earnings. Unfortunately, I had to add that question mark at the end there, because politically the country has had some very big challenges lately. So that's the disappointing part of that picture. It doesn't guarantee political stability, but we haven't had the riots in Malawi that we had in other parts of Africa where food prices went through the roof. But even having said that, my greatest disappointment came a few weeks ago when I saw the results of the Malawi DHS, which looked at the nutritional outcomes. The reason I was looking forward to this, it was a perfect example. We were basically covering the pre-subsidy, post-subsidy, those 5 years. And I had my fingers crossed, but as many nutritionists warned me, you probably won't see much of a difference. Well, there was a difference, and you can argue 53 down to 47% stunting it's going in the right direction at least, but it's still horrendous. Half of the children are stunted, half of the children will have impaired cognitive abilities for the rest of their lives. So the point here, increasing food production on its own is not enough. It has to be combined with better utilization, better health care, and better diversification of diets. And that's really the multi-sector approach that I'm describing here. So what would be my take-home messages out of all this? Number one that I want to leave with you is that I do believe, as an agriculturalist, with experience in that region and in Asia, I see Africa as very much the last frontier and potentially a future salvation of regional and global food security. Incredibly important. We need to take some lessons from the Green Revolution, the Asian Green Revolution, particularly in terms of the importance of technology, the importance of good policies, the importance of political leadership. We need to avoid some of the downsides of the Green Revolution. We need to have a greener, or some people call it doubly green revolution, with much more sensitivity to pesticide use and the like, which created a number of negative problems. We need to focus more on rain-fed agriculture. We should not discard new science opportunities on emotional and philosophical grounds. And if you know where I'm headed to here, it's, some people who know me, it's about GMOs, all right? Yeah, right. I think we should take this to Occupy Wall Street, really. That we need to get the message across that all GMOs are not bad. And we can talk about that in discussion time. Modern information technologies, mobile phones, this can create a breakthrough not only in your business, in the humanitarian aid business, but also in agriculture. And we need to work with the private sector, the big private sector, the companies that know logistically how to move food and how to move inputs, because they know it a hell of a lot better than governments and, frankly, NGOs, and certainly academics. So if we can work more closely and more effectively, as indeed WFP is doing, with the skills of the private sector, we might get somewhere. Leadership is important. And we've got a few folks here, and these two guys here, you mentioned Brazil, Lula and President Kufuor of Ghana, both recognized for what they were able to do for hunger, and I think the idea of South-South is very much part of this. But a bit of help from the North doesn't hurt either, and if we can all put pressure on these folks, I mean, they're on our side. I've heard Hillary Clinton speak a number of times, and she gets it completely, but somehow the other folks who actually decide on where the money goes don't get it yet. So we've got to do something about that. And even Bill Gates, you know, he gets it as well. So that's the story, folks. I'll stop here and open it up for discussion.
Thank you. I guess I'm left with this question. I'm interested, Ms. Lawson and Mr. Denning, to find out what role does foreign aid play in the progression of famines, and especially in the prevention of you being able to rebuild the agricultural sector in Africa?
Should I start? I was just writing a note here saying that the appeal for the Horn of Africa, just for reference, is $1 billion. Mm-hmm. And that comprises all the different sectors, not just food, which sounds like a lot. I found it horrifying when I heard that. I didn't find it so horrifying when I compared it to the bonuses that were paid out to some bankers somewhere in New York, I saw a statistic which was about $3.5 billion. So that helped me put it in context. I also find it interesting that even in this time of restricted, tightened budgets, it's 80% funded. Ironically, for WFP, what I would say here is the food component of the appeal, as it's called, is completely funded, as it always, usually, I should say, is. And right now, we're actually urging people to fund the health sectors, which, for the reasons that were mentioned, they are not doing as well, the nutrition sectors. And then also, we find it absolutely crucial for people to support the agencies that do have access in the areas where WFP does not, which is Médecins Sans Frontières, but also ICRC. And they need our support not just in terms of resources, but in some of the things that are unusual that they ask us to do. I mean, I think the negotiations that are going on there for people's lives, they're very crucial, and the more we meddle in those, the more difficult they become. I think there's a lot of work to do around advocacy. I think a lot more of the kind of discussions that Glenn is getting started with are very helpful. Those are the things I think. But in terms of the logistics and what needs to be done, I think those things are in place. That would be my...
Yes.
On the funding, on aid. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Yeah. In 2005 in Malawi, I sat down with the UN team there, and because of the drought the previous year, we put this appeal together. I don't know if it was an appeal or a call or something. You have these terminologies, and we thought we'd be really smart. We'll have the food aid part, but we'll also have a part that provided seed, fertilizers, and so on. So we had two parts to this, a double-barrel appeal to the donor community. The food aid was fully funded. The development, the longer-term recovery stuff, none of it was funded. So the government said, we've had enough, we'll just fund it ourselves. Which is, you know, that's, say, well, that's good. They, you know, took responsibility. You know, where did they get the money from? This is not a rich country. They presumably took it out of the schools, the clinics that they were going to build, and some roads. They didn't have a military to speak of. So it really wasn't that good. But still, they managed to do that over 5 or 6 years, and to this day, and it's had a big impact without the donors. That's not an argument against donors. That's actually still, I think, donors have a role to play. At the end of the day, for these kinds of investments, you need extra money. There's no question. And there's two sources. There's tax revenue or some kind of outside resource. This is for public investment, not private investment. So when the local resources are not enough, you do need aid. And it's very clear, even after the L'Aquila G8 declaration, followed by the Pittsburgh G20 meeting, there was a $22 billion commitment to agriculture and food security, and only a small fraction of that has ever been delivered. It was meant to be $22 billion over 3 years. Well, the 3 years are up. And the latest figures I've seen, it's about $6 or $7 billion, and most of it was pre-programmed. So it actually preceded the $22 billion commitment. So honestly, we talk about governance. We give countries a hard time about poor governance. We really need to look at our own governance. The latest program that was meant to follow on from this was a special trust fund for smallholder agriculture. It was established with great fanfare in April of 2010. $1 billion were committed. We've got about $600 million out of that. It's not bad to some extent, but one of the biggest donors, who I won't mention, has still not come forward with the $400 million that they had promised. So it's all about, you know, good governance all around, but it does definitely need investment. The one thing that's starting to change, particularly in Africa, is many countries are now generating a lot of revenues through oil and gas and minerals and various kinds. As a result, there is more of an opportunity now for those governments to fund their development needs, including agriculture.
Thank you. Mr. Mclean, I have a question for you about Médecins Sans Frontières funding. I know that you guys are privately funded. So when you're giving aid, especially when you're trying to provide medical services, how are you guys handling the extra expense of providing food and security and dealing with refugees? Is there a strain on the funding resources of Médecins Sans Frontières?
Yeah, I'm not. Oops, sorry. I'm not sure I got the question exactly. I mean, we're predominantly privately funded, but we do take some institutional. Well, we do receive some institutional funding. It's about 90% privately funded, Médecins Sans Frontières. But then we'll launch appeals if we have an emergency of a scale, for example, of what's happening in Somalia today. So yeah, no, it hasn't been the problems we face in Somalia are not financial as such. I mean, it's getting it's not just about dumping money into Mogadishu or anywhere else. It's actually about accessing those populations in need. And that's when we talk about constraints. That's the biggest problem we face.
Money can't buy that.
No, it can't, unfortunately. So yeah, no, it's that hasn't really been an issue. But then maybe ACF has a different perspective on it.
Yeah, maybe I can just add something to the general situation. I mean, we heard about the general economic crunch, the food prices. I mean, it affects the whole economy in the world, and it affects as well institutional donors, different governments in terms of their budget available. We've had the big talks here in the US as well. The same happens to other countries, other donors, and hence there is an economic crunch which affects everything. So even the availability of institutional funding to NGOs, to WFP as well. And we see a lot of shift in terms of policy as well, which a lot of donors call the value for money and the business cases, where they want to clearly see the kind of investment they get to get the most out of it in terms of beneficiary numbers, in terms of population supported, in terms of what exactly is transferred and addressed, and the whole discussion about the agriculture, how large can we go to actually have the biggest impact. So looking at the controversy around that move towards the value for money, and still being much more interested to actually respond to emergencies once they happen or once they're actually existing, which is much more expensive, but it gives much bigger visibility because we're saving lives. So with the shift of value for money and hence prevention or longer-term development, sustainable development being much more cost-efficient and actually more value for money because we can reach more people, we can have longer-term access. The Millennium Villages have been much longer-term, the integrated approach, etc., been able to change people's life and have probably been much more cost-efficient and much better value for money than an emergency response to save those 11 million people around the Horn of Africa at the moment. So following that change of policy into the value for money, hopefully there will be a shift as well to say, yes, let's invest much earlier into that prevention, into improved resource management, into improved disaster risk management, the resilience aspect, the reduction of vulnerability, so we do not need to go into that emergency response and invest much larger monies to reach much less.
On that note, I would like to ask all of you, why did the response take so long? I mean, you have the emergency systems in place to alert you that this was about to happen, and yet the international community failed to act. That would have saved a lot of money in the interim. So what caused the delay in the response?
Who wants to take that one?
Firstly, I'm not convinced that the delay in the response is actually the main problem. I mean, we've mentioned it already that it's very difficult to get, whether you're talking about institutional funds or private funds, whatever, to get to make those type of appeals before something happens. When you talk about emergency relief, I mean, you've been speaking about the difficulty of funding longer-term development activities. Yeah, so I mean, this is not the first time in the last few years that there's been an appeal that's gone out for a pending drought nutrition crisis in Somalia. And they're just generally ignored. And so the fact that this one happened to be accurate, for me, it's not the problem of reactivity. And again, sorry to sort of keep beating on the same topic, but yeah, you can have all the funding you want. If you cannot access those parts of the country where people are really the most affected, then what use is that early warning system anyways? When we talk about, and you related a little bit to your previous question about funding not just for MSF but others, actually, most NGOs are blacklisted to work in South Central Somalia, especially those that are based in the US. Most UN agencies, with the exception of UNICEF, are banned by the Al-Shabaab movement from working in areas under their control. So even if there been a massive mobilization of not just funding but resources in general, including human, to react to a pending emergency or a slow developing emergency, which, as you say, we've known about it since late last year. It's almost academic now. I mean, what difference would that have actually made in the oil setup? And I think not that very much. And from MSF's time, little perspective as one actor in this mess. I mean, we certainly scaled up our programs much earlier than the famine was declared, a crisis was declared. It became very mediatized. But having said that, I mean, we're just one actor among many, and certainly we make no pretensions of being able to do more than what we've been able to do. But yeah, again, I'm a bit cautious about that sort of blame that's thrown around for lack of mobilization.
Down there. Oh.
You're not going to make me repeat myself, are you?
Speak close to the mic.
Speak close to the microphone. I think for me, or for us as an Action Against Hunger or multiple NGOs, I think there's 3 different levels of how come we had a lot of information and we weren't able to react earlier. One is there's always a big discussion about the reliability of the data. Very often it comes out of a process with different partners, discussions, qualitative information, quantitative information, which is put together. And there is, for instance, I think there was a reference to FuseNet as well. They issue an alert. In the past, there have been issues or alerts issued which weren't founded, so people get more and more reluctant to actually believe what they see on the paper. There's as well a problem in terms of the control of information. A lot of governments keep information under control by themselves. Ethiopia probably a classic case where we see that anything which is gathered in terms of early warning systems, and they become more and more sophisticated. We have satellite imagery now involved as well, especially on the drought situations, vegetation and stuff. So there's a lot of information, reliable information as well available, but a lot of governments want to control because they do not want to be seen as failing to respond to the needs of their own population. So governments have the tendency of releasing the information maybe just to the moment where it really is so bad that they can't deal with the situation anymore, and then it becomes really, really complicated. Lastly, a lot of donors, and it was as well the donor reaction in terms of waiting to see what is going to happen. A lot of donors, institutional donors, need to be able to release emergency funding and crisis funding, need the declaration of a disaster by the local government. And I think there was only one local government, for the matter of fact, who released a declaration like that, and that was Kenya in June or July this year. So all the others actually didn't. So it is really difficult for institutional donors as well to release money into the emergency channel and support any responses through different partners and stakeholders. So I think those 3 levels need to be kept in mind as well, even though we have a lot of information which might be more and more reliable throughout those last years in terms of developments, but it still doesn't open up all the doors we will need to open up in a timely manner.
I would add to that that I think there is a sense of frustration that it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole, and even for us on a small level, and I'm sure others have experienced this, you can work with a family, rehabilitate the family, and then you move on thinking everything is good now, but there is nothing in place for that family. And if it was a malnourished child that you treated, they will be back in the clinic 6 months later for the same reasons that they were back there. And it doesn't make sense after a while to keep support. What are we doing different? What are we doing different? Oh, you've got a plan of action. There was not a lot of momentum behind it. I would love to hear, Glenn touched on it, but there's been a systematic divestment in agriculture. African agriculture is not, I don't want to even get into why that might be. I don't think you had suggested that it was philosophical reasons. I think they're a little more, this is where the UN hat is a little bit of a constraint. There's been a reduction of an investment in agriculture, and it's interesting to think about why. He mentioned the structural adjustment period where, these these ministries, the agriculture, the whole context has been really damaged, and how to fix that. It takes a long-term investment. You know, some people feel like this should be the African government, some people feel like this should be the bank. I think Glenn can really help us understand that. But then I think also, let's not dance around the fact that there's a lot of frustration with the government of Somalia, who are not necessarily always seen to be as cooperative as they could be. Yeah. So political will and a frustration with putting water into a bucket with a hole.
Very diplomatic.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
I'd like to hear from the audience, if that's okay. So let's hear what they have to say.
Let's open it up for questioning. Hold on, let's see. Is it best? Can you hear me with this mic?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
You want me to start it off?
No, I honestly do want to hear from.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to stick to a couple questions. First of all, concerning the land grabs, clearly there are some pros and cons to this situation. There's the benefit of potential for investment in agriculture, but at the same time, there are a lot of negative aspects and the risk of backlash. What approaches do you think should be taken to resolve the issue of land grabs? And clearly, there are some institutional constraints preventing documentation of land ownership and things like this. So what sort of actual potential solutions are there? And then my other question is about something that was in the news this afternoon about the African Union and the discussion concerning possibility of deploying Ethiopian troops to Somalia. And what impacts you think that will have. So, and that's anybody who wants to respond to those.
I get the land grab. You get the soldiers. You know what to do. You know, ultimately, a lot of these deals, I mean, they're really being done between governments or between investors and governments, right? The sovereignty of the government in the end, I mean, they have the final say. So how do you make sure that the will of the people involved and the people concerned and potentially the people disadvantaged gets to the surface? Now, it depends. In some cases, I believe there are governments with goodwill that would respond to information that they had. So I think the first thing we need is, you know, more transparent information. I know some of you may be familiar with the efforts that were made in the extractive industries, the EITI, Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which basically opened up a lot of information to those who signed on. That information would be available to the public about revenues and deals that were done in order to you know, extract oil or coal or whatever it was in the country. Those kinds of deals are not being made transparent at the moment by, you know, in the agricultural area. And those who are doing the best job of that are the NGOs, the international NGOs. I know Oxfam is very strong in this area, but they're also, I believe, there's a lot of support now going into local community groups and local NGOs to raise awareness. In some countries, I'm not sure what you can actually do. The deals are done in the you know, the quiet ministry corridors and back rooms. But in fact, you know, the more people are aware of these kinds of deals, the better, and therefore we have to make sure that they're as fair as they can be, because you can put a lot of principles. Those quotes that I used, some of those data came from a World Bank publication that identified the 7 key principles of responsible agro-investing, and they're all great, but how are they implemented? Who's accountable? How transparent are the results? So I think the international agencies have to be serious about this. There has to be pressure put on governments to open their books to the kinds of deals that are done, and we have to support civil society to bring any grievances to the attention of the broader public.
I was going to take the one about the Ethiopians possibly moving in. We were saying that it's actually the second time now that the Ethiopians would have gone into Somalia. The first time they went in was to overthrow the Islamic courts, and it had all kinds of implications. I think it's important to remember that neither Kenya nor Ethiopia go into these countries alone. There are a lot of proxy interests and proxy wars, and not just from the countries in the region, but for example, in this latest military incursion by Kenya, there were French naval support, US drones, so there are a lot of discussions going on before any of these actions are taken, and it would be interesting to know what is behind the new Ethiopian kind of push. I think it's worth keeping in mind the local context. In Kenya, you have an election coming up very soon, and this is liable to get mixed in with that in all kinds of nefarious ways. Ethiopia has the Ogaden region, which just borders with Somalia, and a lot of issues there. So Ethiopia is not trying to hear any funny business from that area, period. And Ethiopia has one of the strongest militaries in Africa and very good relationships with other powers. So just to say that there are so many things, I think it was Silke who said, Somalia is like not even the playground, but it's the tabula where all this gets played out. There are a lot of people with business interests in conflict. I mean, conflict can make a lot of money. I think those are the reasons. But it's good to remember that there are regional bodies in which these powers can talk, which was not the case as much before. Like IGAD is a regional body there, and that is where these kind of things can be talked out, as well as the AU and others, I would say.
I would just point out that the Ethiopians never left, and you know, in Ghetto notably, I mean, they're ever present, and as are numerous militias that are supported directly by the Ethiopians. And I would just add, you asked in terms of the effects, this would probably be the greatest gift possible to the Al-Shabaab. I mean, the more that they can rouse sort of nationalistic, xenophobic opposition, and sort of it helps their very clearly decreased popularity. So it can only improve their situation. So I mean, you can put two and two together and imagine the effects of that, for me at least.
Any more questions?
Well, needless to say, you know, all the challenges that you face in the ground in Somalia, I mean, compared to other humanitarian actions that, you know, let's say in a Pacific country where there is no conflict, I'm sure that is easier to operate in a way, no? But from your experience in the ground, how true are the allegations that these rebels groups get actually things that are meant to be for you know, for these, you know, things that are done for donations from, you know, food or any other issues? I mean, how true is that, you know, this goes to the rebels, and can this, you know, can something be done about that? How do you deal with that? That's one question. And the second question I have is, you know, about the humanitarian aid workers that are being kidnapped or, you know, something done to them. I mean, I'm sure that that's also a big challenge. Is there anything that, you know, you foresee that can, you know, improve this situation also?
I wanted to talk about the humanitarian workers being targeted. WFP has lost about 20 staff in Somalia and in many other places as well. I think together with the NGOs and other humanitarians, there's a lot of effort made to separate what we're doing from the political. You know, we're the soft targets. We are the ones who are out in the field. The people who are making political decisions that Al-Shabaab and others might not like, they sit somewhere else. So the humanitarians try very hard to keep themselves completely distinct from those discussions, from whatever's happening. Now, perception is another issue, and we spend a lot of time debating whether your average Somali, do they know the difference between WFP and the TFG rep? I mean, Somalis have had the UN in their country so long, they are so informed about the programs, and in that sense. But also, the UN is the UN. No one is, you know, it's a fantasy to think that people are saying, no, but you know, they're humanitarians, so let's not target them. No, you go for a soft target. So distance from the political.
Yeah, just a mini addition maybe in terms of there is attention now to this region because there is a big crisis, and yes, everybody knows that there has been people kidnapped. I think we need as well to consider that that is not the first time and the only time when that is happening. We had in 2009, we had 6 staff in Somalia and the Somalia project itself kidnapped. In 2009 as well, we had 3 international staff kidnapped from Kenya into Somalia. So this is happening as well without major emergencies. That is happening in Afghanistan, that is happening in Sudan, that is happening all over the place. But it probably never reaches the level of media attention if there is not a big crisis and attention already anyway. So I think it's nothing particular to emergencies itself, but rather to general chronic context of insecurity or political instability as well.
Yeah, I guess if I understood the first question, it was a diversion of aid on the part of well, you mentioned specifically rebel groups or.
Yeah, any diversion of aid, you know. But I mean, I was thinking particularly in rebels, but if there is other situation, yeah.
Well, given that so little actually gets outside of Mogadishu, the greatest diversion takes place looting in the distributions in Mogadishu itself by government soldiers. So that's probably the first problem. We're not even talking about rebels in that case. We're talking about the official authority, at least the recognized authority. So that's problematic in itself. But then certainly the same thing takes place on a much smaller scale, given much smaller amounts that actually reach South Central Somalia. And whether we're talking about the Al-Shabaab movement or Al-Sunnah and other pro or anti-government groups. And for me, when I'm asked this in interviews on media and whatever else, I usually really piss off the communication handlers in headquarters by saying, well, actually, no, we cannot guarantee there's not diversion. You can't be naive in that environment. And of course, you do everything possible to minimize that. And for an organization like MSF focusing on medical work, it's a little bit easier because groups are less likely to steal vaccines and IV fluids and so on. Although I do have a recurring nightmare of a big bearded militiaman with a Kalashnikov and plumpy nut in each hand. But that's plumpy nuts and therapeutic food. But
mainly the food.
But no, there is no guarantee that it can happen. You simply try to minimize the risks. But given that it does happen even in a place where we do have access, like Mogadishu, you know very well it's happening elsewhere. And unfortunately, humanitarian aid is a very long, fairly sordid history as well of diversion and compromises and occasionally cover-ups as well for that. Something the donors don't especially like to hear, but it's a fact.
Thank you.
And minimizing risks, we use armed guards in Somalia, much like everyone else does, almost everyone else. The only place we do that.
I was going to say, leave it for the UN to say.
My question would be a little bit more of a sort of just wide perspective of a foreigner. Sort of, I'm looking at all humanitarian aid, especially coming through the World Bank, and we've been talking a lot among like the university students. What is your realistic view on those barriers of accessibility, like the barrier that the local government sets? What is that? What is really behind it? The fear to lose control over the country, because we have seen, for example, that in Tanzania, the free market led to the same starvation within the population. And then, we're talking about yes, economically they are developing, but what is that development if the local population gains nothing, but the foreign market gets the expensive great fish and stuff like that? So is that, because only a stupid governor refuses when you have a crisis and total starvation of population refuses from a free help, right? So and what is the way that you see to eliminate, to finally ruin these barriers in a safe way, not pushing the local government into the fear of losing national identity and being sort of economical colony of humanitarian donors?
Yes.
I don't know. I'll answer a question. I'm not sure if it was that one. But the whole issue around aid effectiveness is an important one, and I think what what we've found over the years, and this is where, you know, the Dambisa Moyo arguments about we basically have to just give up on aid, I think are, you know, completely wrong. What we have to do is learn from both the successes and the failures of aid in the past. We know that aid has been used to prop up friends, okay, by all sides. You know, right. Few are exempt from that. We know that aid has been used to promote goods and services of a country, okay? But we also know there have been some incredibly successful deployments of aid. I mean, there's been some amazing success in the health sector in Africa, immunizations, malaria, experience of distributing anti-malaria bed nets. In many parts of Africa, basically malaria has disappeared. You know, that's not the end of the story, but there are some big successes out there. Aid has been a major contributor to a number of countries being able to improve their agriculture.